Hi folks, welcome to the program. I'm Wes Kale. Today we're going to be talking about something I call the accountability matrix. Now we've alluded to the concept of accountability in several of our previous videocasts, but today we're going to directly address the concept of accountability. As you may know, trying to determine who's accountable and for what they're accountable can often be a very confusing situation, as there are many different pieces that are in motion at any one point in time. And this is particularly true of interactions between managers and their subordinates, as the relationships can become somewhat entangled in terms of accountability. Well, we're going to introduce you to a tool today, the accountability matrix, that allows you to separate out who's accountable in some of the most confusing and complex situations you'll face. And it also has the side benefit of instilling higher levels of personal accountability among your staff. In later videocasts, we'll build off of the material that we set forth here to address the more complicated situation dealing with group accountability, where you have multiple folks who are taking on responsibility for different interrelated aspects of a single endeavor. But for today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the more controlled interaction that takes place between a manager and their subordinate, and how you can use the accountability matrix to parse out who's on first. Are you, the manager, accountable? Is your staff member accountable? Are you both accountable? What is the case here? And what do you do about it? So, with that said, let's take a look at our agenda. In delimiting accountability, I will outline this thing we call accountability, break it up into its logical components, and then explain where the breakdowns usually occur when you try to hold people accountable later on down the road. In fixing accountability, I will explain why it is so hard in manager-staff interactions to pin down accountability in a sure and fair way, so we understand the problem we're trying to solve by fixing accountability. And this will lead directly into the accountability matrix, which is the tool we offer to govern accountability assessments and follow-up actions. And finally, we'll review. So let's take a look at our first topic. The first thing that makes exercising accountability a little tricky is that it has two related but distinctly different meanings. The first meaning is that of being responsible. You are responsible for fulfilling an obligation, you're responsible for achieving an outcome, for serving a purpose, or whatever. But you are looked to as being expected to be responsible for achieving something. And with responsibility comes the associated recognition, both good and bad, for carrying out that responsibility. If you do well, you have the standing to expect to be rewarded for fulfilling your responsibilities, and if you do poorly, then you can expect to be admonished for failing to meet your responsibilities. And of course, there's a broad range of rewards and admonishments. The second meaning is that of having to explain why and what. And these whys and whats could be almost anything, but typically they will be along the lines of what happened here, what went wrong, why is this not working, why did you do it that way? Whatever the case of the why or the what, the second key sense of the term accountability is that you're going to have to explain things. You are expected to be able to explain what is going on. And you may recall that we listed being good at explaining yourself as being among the top 5 practices of successful project managers that we discussed back in videocast 3. With accountability, you need to be able to explain things. Interestingly, when you think about these two meanings of accountability, responsibility for a condition or outcome and having to explain the why and the what, they both apply in almost all situations of personal accountability. They may not apply equally, but they're both present in almost all cases. Seldom is the case that you will be expected to explain something without you or someone else being responsible for what is going on. Secondly, these two meanings of accountability sometimes get misassociated. That is, we target the wrong people to explain what is going on, or we blame the wrong people. We'll talk more about that under fixing accountability. And finally, accountable individuals tend to focus on the first meaning. What am I responsible for? What do I get if I do well? How bad will it be if I screw up? And they don't typically give much thought to making sure they can explain things. They basically try to wing it on the fly when there's a problem, or they ultimately succeed. However, their bosses tend to focus upon the second sense. Does this guy know what is going on? Can he reassure me that it's under control? Before worrying about responsibility. Supervisors may eventually get around to the praising or the yelling, but they first want to know what happened and why. This is an important understanding for you to take to heart. We touched upon this in Videocast 9, How to Succeed, where we said that when preparing for a status update, you should not try to get one more thing done on your project plan before the update. Instead, you should stop what you're doing and prepare to explain what you've already accomplished. The same is true here. You should always be able to explain what is going on. You are expected to be able to explain yourself, so you need to make sure that you reserve time and energy for being able to explain things. And one final observation is that both senses of accountability deal with expectations. You are expected to be responsible. You are expected to be able to explain why. An inability to do either is a failure to meet expectations. Once again, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, the next thing you should know about accountability is that it has a scope or a range. The common understanding of a scope of responsibility or accountability is that it is principally concerned with the breadth of what you are accountable for. What are all the functions or people or things that I'm on the hook to be responsible for? We'll use this disc to illustrate what we mean. You can see that we're using the diameter to illustrate the breadth of your responsibilities. When you are assigned a responsibility that you'll be accountable for, the first thing you do is assess if there's more than you can do. We'll use this little blue wedge here to indicate what you are capable of doing. Now, in this case, it's clearly obvious that there's too much in this tasking for you to do by yourself. This is where you're going to ask to have some things taken off your plate or seek additional resources. And that's also where the concept of group accountability enters the discussion, something we'll discuss in a later videocast. However, in the case we're going to consider today, what you are able to do actually comprehends the breadth of what you are expected to do. This then is something that, at first blush, both you and your supervisor will expect you to knock out on your own. Now, that said, once you understand the breadth of what you are being assigned, something that may occur to you, but probably will not until there's a problem, is the depth of expectations around things. You see, when we were talking about the breadth of expectations, we were really talking about the highest level of expectations, those around delivery. What are the outcomes? What are the things that you're expected to achieve? But there are other expectations that go along with that. For example, quality expectations, the methods you use to achieve and meet expectations, and how much risk folks are willing to tolerate before they're going to raise an objection. And when problems arise, it is in inspecting these elements, the breadth and depth of your expectations, that you, the manager, detect the apparent cause of why things are going awry. In your interaction with your direct reports, it is clear that there's missed expectations, and the discussion inevitably revolves around the clarity of the expectations in each of these dimensions of delivery, quality, how, and risk. In short, you and your subordinates may have a difference of opinion as to whether you were clear enough in stating what it is that you expected. And there may very well be some legitimacy in this, as you may have instructed your staff to just get her done, and now you're upset with how things turned out because you didn't specify the way they should get her done. However, while the clarity of expectations is undoubtedly an issue, two more common sources of the problems with assigning accountability deal with whether a person has the adequate authority and power to do what you're asking them to do, and whether they are really competent to do what it is you assume they can do. You may assume that they are, but they may not be. And so while the actual execution of attaining the delivery expectations that you asked for is the apparent cause, it's not always the only cause. We have to be willing to look at all three sets of assumptions in order to identify where things broke down and where we're going to have to apply accountability. And so this somewhat tangled web of determining accountability begins with the fact that there are two different meanings to accountability that are viewed with different priorities by the two principal actors, those in authority and those who are their subordinates. And then the discussion gets spun further off track by focusing solely on the objective results as the problem, when the source of the issue may very well lie in our assumptions about each of these three areas. And that's how we get into an accountability mess. So the question is, how do we get out of it? Well, things start off pretty simply. You basically are not seeing the results that you expect. So I don't want to mislead you here. You're going to want to start off with your own powers of observation telling you that something's not right. Okay, and I need to find out what's going on. You want to start there, okay, with that thread. The point I was trying to make on the previous slide is not to be hasty and to assume that the root cause of the problem is within the scope of what has been asked and the clarity around that, or in the simple failure of your subordinate to get something done. There may be other factors at work here. So we just don't want you to be hasty, but you will start off with something very objective. You don't like what you're seeing. Now, you may not be sure anything is actually wrong, but it's certainly not clear that things are fine. And so you're going to start asking questions to figure out what is going on. And this is where you've got to be careful about making wrong turns in your investigation into the matter. Now, as the manager, the first wrong turn you can make is that you will ask the wrong person. Instead of going to the person who is most clearly accountable in your mind for what is going on, you take an indirect approach and ask someone who is either a stakeholder or peripherally involved in the activity what their view is of the situation. You don't go to the source. You're not alone in this. It's been my experience that most people will start off by going to the wrong person most of the time. And there are several reasons why we do this, and some of those reasons are good and some not so good. For example, if your boss or an influential peer is the person you see as the responsible party, well, then you may not want to start off the conversation by asking them what's wrong. You see, by asking them what is going on or what's wrong, the underlying assumption is that you're seeing something that is off kilter and they're responsible for that, and this could easily put them on the defensive, not the thing you want to do with your boss or an influential peer. So what you'll do is you'll sneak around to a secretary or some other trusted resource who might have the information you need. Another reason you might choose to be indirect in your approach is that you just want to gather some background material to better prepare yourself for the eventual conversation with the accountable individual. No one likes looking clueless. Or perhaps you're just really not sure who's on first on this thing, so you happen to grab the first victim who happens to walk by. But whatever the reason is, when you do so, when you ask the wrong person, chances are you will not get sufficiently complete or accurate information to address your concern. There's going to be a nagging doubt out there. After all, you haven't gone to the source. And when the poor schmuck that you're questioning begins to feel like you're applying the third degree, that's when you usually see the second wrong turn, which is the propensity of folks to engage in evasive answers, or what I call the duck and cover. Now, whether someone is the properly accountable individual or not, when your questions start to make them feel uncomfortable about where your line of inquiry is going, you can expect that they will start to bob and weave in their answers. They will become evasive or point the finger at someone else or employ any number of techniques to avoid getting pinned down for accountability. And when this happens, this is when you start to get confused or frustrated or distrustful or all of the above as you're going through this. It can feel like you're playing whack-a-mole. You're trying to pin down the specifics of what is going on to include accountability, and everyone is ducking down in their hole to avoid getting whacked. And that is why you cannot make the third wrong turn of forgetting about the assumptions that we just talked about on the previous page. You have to go back to these assumptions to structure your approach as you delve into this matter. You need to establish what is going on with whom is responsible. So to avoid getting sucked down into the cycle of violence, let's back up a second. The first two wrong turns are actually pretty easy to deal with. Now, while I may not be able to persuade you to overcome human nature and to begin going to the source more often when you are probing around into things, because we've already covered the clarification technique, I'm hopeful that both you and your subordinates are better prepared for coping with your fishing expeditions when you ask the wrong person. Because that's what you're doing. When you go to the wrong person, you are engaging in a fishing expedition. And I'm hopeful that your staff have had an opportunity to review the clarification technique. And so when you go to the wrong people, they all will be better equipped to get at the basis of legitimacy of why you're asking the questions you are, and to redirect your questions into a more constructive avenue. So while I encourage you to be more direct when appropriate in your investigations, if you choose not to, it's not a showstopper. The clarification technique can take care of it. Similarly, efforts to duck and cover, whether they are proffered by your staff or managers, can be easily pierced with the clarification technique as well. Now, because there are several flavors to this technique of ducking and covering, and you may not be sure of what the specific questions are to penetrate such efforts to deflect accountability, in the template section of this videocast, I provided some good questions you can use to penetrate the four most common duck and cover techniques.